From 1914 to 1918, the terrible conflict we know as World War I ravaged Europe, leaving scars that still haven't healed over a century later. It was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but it ended nothing. I'm a high school history teacher, and this video isn't about how World War I started, why it ended, or its global consequences. This video is about the horrors of the war, the struggles of ordinary young men and their families as they were forever changed by this terrible conflict. I recently played Ad Infinitum, a horror game set during World War I which follows a young German soldier named Paul von Schmidt and his family. Today we'll explore the historical context behind the events of Ad Infinitum, using real memoirs from veterans of the Great War to add to the discussion. Without further ado, let's discuss the horrors of World War I. From the moment you boot up Ad Infinitum, you're immersed in the bleak tone of the story. The dreary background and somber music hints that this won't be a tale of heroism and sacrifice for the greater good. The prologue begins with the player awakening suddenly in a bunker. I nervously draw a bird in my diary, but am interrupted by an incoming message on the telegram. We see the message Morgengrauen, and I start to panic. We're on the western front of World War I, and we've been ordered to assault the enemy's trenches. Grabbing my rifle, I leave the relative safety of the bunker and head outside. The sound of machine gun fire punctuates the chaos of officers barking orders and soldiers marching ahead. I cautiously move through the muddy mess of barbed wire, corpses, smoldering wreckage, shell craters, and pools of poisonous water. Some of the pools are deep enough that I'm briefly submerged. Then, suddenly, a massive explosion. I awaken tangled up in barbed wire, blood dripping, and my left hand is gone. I see a shadowy figure ahead and I scream out for help, and it cuts to black. The depiction of trench warfare in this prologue is quite effective. In real life, the trench networks that ran along the Western Front from the English Channel to Switzerland were extensive and well fortified. Communication trenches ran between the front lines and the rear, where the command posts and officers' quarters were located. Machine guns would be positioned along the front lines to halt enemy advances. Artillery guns were positioned far behind the front lines, capable of hitting the enemy from miles away. In the middle, between the trench systems, was no man's land, so called because no man could survive there. In his memoir, Undertones of War, British World War I veteran Edmund Blunden describes it as a land of despair. Bodies and their useless gear heaped the gross waste ground. The slimy road was soon only a mud track. The shell holes were mostly small lakes of what was no doubt merely rusty water, but had a red and foul semblance of blood. Paths glistened weakly from tenable point to tenable point. The winding path in the prologue of Ad Infinitum demonstrates this chaos. This tangled mess of barbed wire, bursts of machine gun fire, sounds of explosives, and dying comrades makes this opening really immersive. Soldiers were forced to charge into this hell in the vain hope that some territory might be gained, but it rarely worked, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands just to gain a few miles of territory. It's fitting that the prologue ends with our character obliterated by an artillery shell. These hellish devices are one of the scariest aspects of World War I. Before soldiers would attempt an assault across no man's land, there would be an artillery barrage. Thousands, millions of shells would be fired at the enemy lines for hours or even days at a time. The constant sound of non-stop explosions drove people to the brink of madness. Gabriel Chevallier, a French veteran of World War I, wrote the following in his memoir titled Fear. The experience of shelling is always the same, a crushing, relentless savagery hunting us down. You feel individually targeted, singled out from those around you. You are alone, eyes shut, struggling in your own darkness in a coma of fear. You feel exposed, feel that the shells are looking for you. First the crash so loud that it shakes your head almost off your shoulders, leaves you dizzy, and then the enveloping smoke that burns your eyes and nose and fills your chest with its unbreathable stench. Every new burst of fire leaves us gasping for breath. We lie prostrate for an hour, suspended between luck and death, until the 2 German batteries run out of shells. A single shell could annihilate an entire platoon of soldiers if it fell in the right place. What does living in this hell do to a person? What we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD was originally called shell shock, named after artillery shells, the source of the trauma. When you watch footage of World War I veterans suffering from shell shock, it's heartbreaking. Their bodies contort, limbs shake, eyes glaze over. They're reliving those helpless nights spent praying that the shells wouldn't find them. German World War I veteran Ernst Junger wrote in his memoir Storm of Steel, "Talking to my comrades, I saw that the incident had rather blunted their enthusiasm for war. That it had also had an effect on me was instanced by numerous auditory hallucinations, so that I would mistake the trundling of a passing cart, say, for the ominous whirring of the deadly shell. This was something that was to accompany us all through the war, that habit of jumping at any sudden and unexpected noise. It bore out the fact that for 4 years we lived in the shadow of death. Soldiers could adapt, become accustomed to some aspects of life in the trenches, the poor quality food, dirty living conditions, and lack of sleep, but they never forgot the shellings. In Fear, Chevallier describes life after the war. As he and other veterans were walking down the street, a passing civilian whistles, mimicking the sound of a falling artillery shell. We throw ourselves to the ground, up against the tree trunks, but instead of an explosion, we hear a roar of laughter. Bloody fool. The man who had imitated the whistle of a shell answers, "You're not used to peace yet." It is true. We are not used to not being afraid. The prologue of Ad Infinitum took place during the war itself, but the majority of the game takes place after the war from the perspective of Paul von Schmidt, a soldier suffering from PTSD. Each of the chapters in this game focuses on how the war affected a different family member. Chapter 1, titled Despair, focuses on our mother. The chapter begins as we awaken in bed, hearing our mother and father arguing. Jolting awake, I explore my room. I find a letter from my brother Johannes. He describes working with a telegraph, and we can infer that he was the one that we played as in the prologue. Given his horrific fate, it's no wonder that Mother was yelling about how everything was taken from her. I walk out into the hall and find a letter written by her, deep in the depths of despair about how the war took her sons from her. Downstairs, I find another letter from Johannes addressed to Mother, in which he explains that it would be best if Germany just surrenders. He worries about the family back home, knowing that food is scarce. In real life, during the war, the British Navy successfully established a blockade of Germany, leading to food shortages throughout the war. This letter is dated April 15, 1917, which is relevant because the winter of 1916-17 was particularly harsh for the German civilians. It became known as the turnip winter because the food shortages were so severe that people resorted to eating rutabagas or Swedish turnips, which were usually fed to pigs. Throughout World War I, thousands of civilians on all sides would die from illness and malnourishment. Back to the letter, Johannes explains that glory and honor perished in the very first winter of this war. Oh, how we wanted to go to war, how foolish we were. This quote reflects one of the biggest social consequences of World War I, disillusionment with traditional values of honor and glory. In Storm of Steel, Junger describes the enthusiasm of his peers when the war broke out. Grown up in an age of security, we shared a yearning for danger, for the experience of the extraordinary. We were enraptured by war. We thought of it as manly, as action, a merry, dueling party on flowered, blood-bedewed meadows, anything to participate, not to have to stay at home. In Ad Infinitum, Johannes, being the older brother, was sent off to the front immediately when war broke out, but Paul was too young at first. Paul wants to join his brother, to not let his family down. This attitude is further exacerbated by the legacy of our grandfather, Lothar von Schmidt, a famous general during Germany's imperial campaigns in Africa in the 19th century. Throughout the game, we learn that Lothar was disappointed in his son, our father, which resulted in our father's expectations that we would redeem his legacy and bring honor back to the family. But those old-fashioned values died in the trenches and mud pits of the Western Front. Throughout his memoir Fear, Chevallier describes his demoralization. At first, he was proud to be suitable material for a soldier, not to belong to that category of despised citizens in the prime of life who have stayed at home. When your country demanded your service, the worst thing you could do was stay home. It's incredible how much times have changed since then. In the midst of his time in the hell of the Western Front, Chevallier writes, "This offensive, which was supposed to take us 25 kilometers forward in one go, had just about managed to gain a few hundred meters in a week. A handful of senior officers had to justify their role to the nation by a few lines of communique that bore the scent of victory. We were there for no other reason than to purchase those few lines with our blood. It was now a matter of politics, not strategy." The respect for authority shared by our father and grandfather in Ad Infinitum was a luxury of the older generations, those who sat in their comfortable chairs and ordered millions to charge to their deaths. The absurdity of it all was not lost on Chevallier, who questioned everything he once believed in. The God of infinite mercy cannot be the God of the plains of Artois. The good God, the just God, could not have allowed such bloody carnage to be carried out in his name, could not have wanted such destruction of bodies and minds to further his glory. God? Come off it. The heavens are empty as a corpse. There's nothing in the sky but shells and all the other murderous devices made by men. This war has killed God, too. Johannes doesn't go quite that far, but judging by his letter, he's been demoralized too. Continuing through the house, on the upper floor of the foyer, I find a letter written by our father. He explains that he administers quicksilver to treat our mother's hysteria, and she soon quiets down. Quicksilver is another name for liquid mercury. Mercury was used to treat a wide range of problems for centuries before we learned how toxic it is. Back to the game, I gathered supplies around the house to repair this mechanical orchestra and conduct a seance with this dummy sitting at the table. A nearby letter shows that Mother was growing desperate, trying to bring Johannes back to life using voodoo magic. I see a vision of a demonic entity pulling me into a mirror and open my eyes again to see that the dummy is gone. I hear disturbing screaming coming from the attic. On my way to investigate, I find a ball floating in a bathtub, and when I try to grab it, I'm pulled in. This begins the first of a series of flashback sections where I find myself back in the trenches. There aren't any sounds of explosives or machine gun fire. Everything is eerily still. As I pass through this post-apocalyptic nightmare, I encounter these monsters feasting on rotten flesh, so I carefully sneak around them. At the church, I find a pile of corpses at the altar and a letter from Johannes. "We have turned the world into hell on earth," he says. Deeper in the church, I find the demonic Mother of Sorrows, who almost finishes me, but I fall down a hole and re-emerge in the trenches. I find another letter. In this one, Johannes describes the suffering of a French soldier who got stuck in barbed wire after being wounded. In real life, no man's land was littered with barbed wire, an attempt to slow any advance. At night, small teams would sneakily crawl through no man's land and clip the wire to prepare for the next morning's attack. Many soldiers got stuck in the barbed wire and never made it out, while others drowned in the deep mud and poisonous pools. As Johannes says, once no man's land has you in its clutches, it never lets you go. I find Johannes' telegraph station and use the table on the wall to translate the Morse code message. I wander ahead into no man's land where I find an officer in a crashed plane. He gets pulled away by some monster and I set off to find them. In a nearby room, I find a letter from Johannes where we get a hint about the identity of the new lieutenant. He shares the same name as Johannes. If you've been paying attention so far, you may have figured out that Paul von Schmidt, our player character, was the new lieutenant. In real life, brothers, friends, and family members did often serve in the same units. It made sense on the surface. You already had bonds and connections with these people, so fighting alongside them would be easier than fighting with strangers. But the problem was that when they were wounded or killed, the trauma was so much worse. In Undertones of War, Blunden writes, "Brothers should not serve in the same battalion. When we were at the place where some of the wounded had been collected under the best shelter to be found, I was struck deep by the misery of a boy whom I knew and liked well. He was half crying, half exhorting over a stretcher. In this battalion, brothers had frequently enlisted together. The effect was too surely a culmination of suffering." If a battalion was ordered to assault the enemy directly across no man's land, or if the enemy's artillery was zeroed in on the right spot, families would lose all of their young men at once. Many towns lost nearly all of their young men to tragedies like this, which is why the generation that fought World War I is often called the Lost Generation. Back in the game, in the command bunker, I hear a knock on the door. When I open it, I see the officer from the plane, his eyes bloodied. I set him down on a nearby cot and head off in search of medicine. I find a letter from a random soldier talking about all the water and mud in the trenches. Now in real life, mud on the Western Front was all-encompassing. In Undertones of War, Blunden describes the muddy mess of no man's land. It was blasted out by intense bombardment into a broad, shapeless gorge, and pools of mortar-like mud filled most of it. A few duckboards lay half-submerged along the parapet. The men fought their way on through the gluey morass until not one nor two were reduced to tears and impotent wild cries to God. Men of the next battalion were found in mud up to the armpits, and their fate was not spoken of. Those who found them could not get them out. The whole zone was a corpse. Mud is always a major obstacle in war, but the intense artillery bombardments of World War I further pulverized the ground, turning the mud into an almost quicksand-like consistency. Men would fall in the mud, never able to escape again. If a soldier spent long enough in the watery, muddy trenches, they could develop gangrene and their feet would have to be amputated. This happened to so many soldiers in World War I that the condition was nicknamed trenchfoot. Moving on, I finally find a vial of morphine, but the demonic Mother of Sorrows attacks and chases me through the watery ruins. The demon represents my mother, her despair at losing her children personified in this grotesque form. In this arena, I had the choice to kill or spare her. I chose to show her mercy, pulling the knife out of her heart, and she disappears. I wake up back in my room at the house. In the foyer, I find some footprints leading to this room where my father sits near the fire. When I go downstairs, he's gone, and all around the room I find my grandfather's belongings. General Lothar von Schmidt is a fictional character, but the events of his life are based on real history. From 1899 to 1901, the Boxer Rebellion took place, in which Chinese rebels tried to forcibly expel Europeans from China. The rebellion was crushed by the combined forces of several European nations and the United States, all of whom either had spheres of influence in China or had an interest in maintaining European control over trade in the region. General von Schmidt apparently helped crush the rebellion. The newspaper also refers to some troubles in Africa. Next to it, we see a letter in which General von Schmidt addresses the Herero people in what's now Namibia. Dated in October 1904, the letter orders the Herero people to leave German territory in Africa or be killed. The Namibian genocide, as this event came to be known, resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands due to starvation, dehydration, and murder. This was apparently a source of pride for General von Schmidt, as he kept several trophies from his time in Africa. Interacting with this horse, we get some flashbacks of dialogue from the dying general, in which he recalls how he and his cavalrymen stood at the gates of Paris. This is a reference to the Franco-Prussian War, in which the German army laid siege to Paris for several months in late 1870. This war led to the unification of Germany, upending the balance of power in Europe, and it's one of the causes of World War I. It's fitting that our grandfather, who served in that war and across the German Empire, would have such high expectations for his son and grandchildren to carry on his legacy and expand German power. Our father was crippled at a young age, never able to learn to ride a horse, and he was a disappointment in grandfather's eyes, so he projected his insecurities onto his sons, encouraging us to join the army when World War I broke out. Nearby, I find a letter from father, who describes his dream of playing a part in German victory by creating a chemical agent that can penetrate the enemy's gas masks. Near the greenhouse is his chemistry equipment. To progress, I have to make this mystery chemical by combining hydrochloric acid and Wilhelmswasser. As I solve the puzzle, I find another note from father, explaining that Paul has been promoted to an officer. Father used his connections in the army to get Paul to serve as the officer for Johannes' unit. After I make the tank heater acid, I use it on the iron chains locking the door to the basement. I head downstairs where I see father tinkering in the shadows. A yellow-green gas spreads through the room and I drop to the floor, gagging as I lose consciousness. When I wake up back in no man's land, I see a large monster slowly walking through the drifting clouds of poison gas. Chemical weapons have been theorized and used in various forms for centuries, and the use of asphyxiating gases was outlawed at the Hague Conference of 1899, but both sides on the Western Front were willing to do anything to break the stalemate. The French were the first to deploy tear gas during the war, but in 1915 the Germans began using chlorine gas. Later on, more deadly versions like mustard gas and phosgene gas were developed. Chlorine and phosgene gas were designed to choke the victim, but mustard gas would cause blistering in the eyes, nose, and throat. In his famous poem Dulce et Decorum Est, British World War I veteran Wilfred Owen remembers the horrors of gas attacks. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind that wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. The slow, agonizing deaths of the victims of the gas stuck in the minds of Wilfred Owen and countless other veterans of World War I. Owen writes this poem to everyone who still believed in the glory of dying for your country. If only the politicians who started the war could see the horror for themselves, if only every civilian knew the suffering and futility of their struggle, then maybe this would never happen again. Veterans weren't likely to share their stories out of fear of being viewed as a coward, but as time went on, the truth came out. The nihilistic massacres of World War I killed romanticism. Who could believe in a sweet death when such terrible weapons as phosgene gas existed? Back to the game, I wait for the wind to blow the gas clouds away before passing through no man's land into the French trenches. I find a pile of corpses, and one of them has a gas mask. When I grab it, I'm greeted by this absolute monstrosity. The animal skulls reminded me of grandfather's trophies from Africa, and this creature is the embodiment of his rage. I take cover in a nearby dugout and let him pass. Much like how the tank was developed in response to the threat of machine guns, gas masks were invented in response to poison gas attacks. So I equip the gas mask and proceed through the clouds of death. In real life, the gas mask would definitely help, but if mustard gas was exposed to your skin, it could still cause sores, and a large enough amount could be fatal. You wouldn't want to walk through clouds of gas. Eventually, I make it back to the German lines, reuniting with the officer I saved earlier. He sends me to the nearby explosives depot in the hopes that we can blow up that giant beast. The creature hates the gas, so I fled portions of the trenches with it to lure it towards the ammo store. When the path is set, it charges right into the stored artillery rounds, destroying the creature with a huge blast. I grab its head and bring it to the officer as proof that the job is done. He sends me on another mission to a munitions factory and gives me a flashlight powered by a ripcord. I follow the rail tracks to the east, and at the end they twist impossibly into this small hole. Crawling through, I find myself in a massive factory. I make contact with the officer, who tells me to turn the power back on. I run around diverting steam power to the correct locations, then I make my way back to the master switch. The gas monster awakens, the personification of my father's corruption. I can choose to either increase or decrease the gas pressure, and I decide to increase it. When all the valves have been turned, I pull the lever in the center and kill the corruption demon with a stab to the brain. I wake up back in the house again, the past still haunting me. The third chapter, Pain, has begun. I see the shadow of a figure standing in my brother Johannes' room. A distorted voice sobs and screams from the attic. Corpses now litter the foyer. A phone rings in the middle of the room. I answer it, and the officer lists the names of the dead, the men we served with in the war. Moving on, I solve a puzzle and head up to the attic. Along the way, I find a letter from a military hospital. It turns out that artillery strike from the beginning of the game didn't kill Johannes, but he's being discharged from the hospital severely disabled. I enter the attic and recall a memory of finding Johannes in bed with his friend Christian. Father was furious, calling him a pervert and a traitor. Homosexuality was certainly not accepted at all in the 1910s, which helps explain the difficult family dynamics. In the next room, the paintings seem to move when I'm not looking, and when I open this door I get jump scared by a pigeon and I black out. I wake up back in the nightmare world, this time in a military hospital. Bodies litter the dimly lit, filthy ground as childhood memories play in the background. In this file cabinet, I find Johannes' medical report. His left arm and both legs were severed and his face disfigured by shrapnel from the artillery, and he has infected wounds all over his body. In fear, Chevallier describes what happens to him after being wounded by an explosive. I've pulled out a lot of shrapnel in my legs. The doctor in an ambulance at the front had probed my wounds and without any anesthetic or my consent had pulled out the biggest pieces of shrapnel. Chevallier goes into gruesome detail about the condition of other men at the military hospital, but I can't describe it here on YouTube. Just know that war is hell, and nowhere is that more evident than a military hospital. Moving on, I grab a pair of cutters to clear the barbed wire blocking my path. In this room, I find limb prosthetics hanging from strings all around, and a music record starts playing. I follow the sound to this room and find enough nightmare fuel to last several weeks. After a long time, I finally gather my courage and venture out into the darkness, avoiding the monsters screaming in pain. I run up these stairs away from the monsters and suddenly I'm back in the trenches. I make contact again with the officer, but to get back to the command bunker I have to pass through these underground tunnels filled with the screaming monsters from the hospital. Eventually I make it back to the bunker and the officer tells me that the cowards back home are trying to pressure Germany into surrendering. In real life, World War I ended while the Germans were still on French soil. Many Germans, including Adolf Hitler, believed that Germany was betrayed and if they just kept fighting they could have won. This mistaken belief was one of the contributing factors of Hitler's rise in popularity in the 20s and 30s. The officer explains that a new enemy is attacking us from the air. We have to defeat it for the fatherland. I head back to the muddy path from earlier and on the ground I find the officer's box with fuses, but suddenly a bird-like monster drops down on me. The officer scares it away and throws me a rifle to go after it. I try to kill it, but it takes me away to this dark void. The monster is a manifestation of Johannes' pain and suffering. To defeat it, I have to activate all the searchlights. In the first one, I see a newspaper describing the outbreak of World War I. In a flashback, Johannes expresses a desire to fight, reflecting that pre-war romantic optimism. In Fear, Chevallier describes the fever-pitch atmosphere when the war broke out. The country policemen bang their little drums and all the churches ring all the bells in their ancient Romanesque towers. All together now, war. Of course, they had no idea about the horrors in store for them. At another searchlight, we see the dummy from the beginning of the game tangled up in spikes and wire. The description reads, "He was as good as dead. He took one look at him among all that wire and ran. He fell but never hit the ground." That scene at the beginning of the game makes sense now. Paul was the man that ran away as we screamed for help. The officer comes over the radio and tells me to kill the monster. In this arena, I have the choice to either kill or spare the creature. I chose to spare it, and the monster fades away. The final chapter, Ad Infinitum, to Infinity, has us confronting the consequences of our decisions. I chose to spare Mother and Johannes, so from them I get fragments of a mirror, but since I killed Father, I see him slumped at his desk. His final words were typed, "Your duty is to die in the trenches." In Fear, Chevallier recalls the reaction of civilians when he honestly answered their questions about the war. "You fought well?" "I really have no idea. What do you mean by fought?" "But you were in the trenches. Did you kill any Germans?" "Not that I know of. I never saw a living armed German before me. I only saw dead Germans. The job had been done." "So what have you actually done in the war?" "What I was ordered to do. No more, no less. I'm afraid there's nothing very glorious in it." "Oh, you do get on my nerves. That's not an answer. I asked you what you did. Would you like to know the chief occupation in war? The only one that matters?" "I was afraid." I must have said something really disgusting, something obscene. They gave a little indignant shriek and ran off. I saw the revulsion in their faces. From the looks they exchanged, I could guess their thoughts. What? A coward? How can this man be French? The horrors of the Western Front were unimaginable to the people back home, who had been brought up on stories of bravado and heroism, but in real life, some men were so shattered by the machine guns, the gas, the artillery, and life in the mud, that they would do anything to get off the front lines. Chevallier explains, "Initially, the easiest way of getting a good wound was to place your hand over the lookout slit that had been targeted by snipers, but bullets in the hand, particularly the left hand, quickly became inadmissible. The officers were catching on to what the men were doing, so the men looked for other ways to get injured and sent home. Another method was to ignite the fuse on a grenade and put it and your own hand on one side of a splinter-proof shield. Your forearm is blown off. Despair in the most punishing sectors can provoke the most absurd decisions. I've certainly heard soldiers expressing the wish to have a limb amputated to escape the front line. Father's note was just absurd. His bitter anger, devotion to the old ideals, and inability to comprehend the horrors of modern war made him come across as an evil character to me, much worse than Mother and Johannes, who were just trying to cope with tragedy. I approach a mirror at the end of the hall and make one more discovery. I was the blind officer. He says there are no half victories and fires his pistol. I wake up in a mental hospital. When Mother and Johannes try to visit me, I see only monsters. My decision to kill Father haunts me. His monstrous form tortures me endlessly in my padded cell, and the credits roll. This was apparently the worst ending. You can get it if you spare one or two of the monsters and kill the others. But if you spare Mother, Father, and Johannes, you get the best ending, which goes like this. We're back in the trenches on the day Johannes was wounded. Memories of playing with him flow in my mind as I approach the spot where he fell. We see what's left of him tangled up in barbed wire, begging for help. Before I can do anything to help him, the officer pulls me away. There are no half victories, he says, not for us. He derides the other characters for their weaknesses, despair, corruption, and pain, but Paul is the worst of all. Why? Because he ordered his company to assault the enemy, and he didn't have the decency to die with the rest of them. Paul struggles with survivor's guilt. After what happened to Johannes and the rest of his men, he feels guilty that he got to go home without any injuries, and especially guilty that he left his own brother for dead. In real life, veterans of war often suffer from survivor's guilt. If only I could have done more, maybe I could have saved them. Or why did I live when they died? We were all exposed to the same shells and bullets, and what hit them could have hit me. Yet, lying still beneath my blanket, eyes closed, I hide the injustice of my good fortune. When life and death came down to luck, the lucky struggled to understand why they lived and others died. The first step to healing from survivor's guilt is to forgive yourself, so Paul gives his evil form a hug, bringing himself back to reality. Now the meaning of the mirror fragments is clear. Paul couldn't bear to look at himself because he blamed himself for what happened, so he smashed the mirror in his room. But now, having forgiven himself, Paul joins his family at the table in the greenhouse. They all hold hands, and the glow of the daylight shines brighter. A better future lies ahead. The cold, inhuman expanse of the Western Front of World War I was an excellent choice of setting for a horror game. Over 15 million people were killed in the war to end all wars. Empires fell, and border disputes arose which still plague the world today. But this game wasn't about that large-scale disaster. It showed how the war affected people on a personal level, on the scale of a single family. To get the best sense of it, we need to listen to the people who actually lived through it. In Undertones of War, Blunden writes, "From the pit, arise and shine. Let the drum and trumpet mark the pride of your measure. You have now learned that the light is sweet, that a day in peace is a jewel whose radiances vary and frolic innumerably as memory turns it in her hand, infinitude of mercy." If you learned nothing else from the horrors of World War I, then hear this. Peace is the most precious thing in the world. Soldiers know the value of peace more than anyone, and may we learn from their example. May those who gave their lives rest in peace, and may the day soon come when war will be just a memory. If you're still watching, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your words of encouragement and constructive criticism help fuel my passion to make this content for you. If you enjoyed this video and maybe learned something, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more content. That's all for today, everyone. I'll see you in the next video, and peace out for now.